Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The carriage wheels left deep impressions in the mud as they approached the Blackwood estate on that autumn evening in 1853. The air hung heavy with the scent of rain and river water from the nearby Santee. Margaret Blackwood stood at the upper window watching as the visitor arrived, her slender fingers pressed against the glass. Behind her, the cradle remained still. It had been still for 3 days now. The plantation house, once vibrant with voices and laughter, had fallen into a peculiar silence that seemed to consume even the sounds from outside. Dr. Abernathy had been summoned from Charleston, and Margaret knew what his arrival meant. Something had happened on the Blackwood plantation that defied explanation, something that the local physician in Georgetown had refused to document. The records from St. Michael's Parish show that between February and September of 1853, 17 people had died on the Blackwood property. All deaths were recorded as natural causes, or fever, but Reverend Thomas Wilson had noted in the margin of the parish register something unusual. The Lord counts all souls in his ledger. This cryptic note would later become significant when researchers from Emory University examined the documents in 1962. What made these deaths particularly strange was not their number, as disease often swept through plantations in the humid South Carolina lowcountry. It was their pattern. Each death corresponded precisely with a significant increase in cotton production on the Blackwood plantation. Margaret Blackwood had arrived in South Carolina in 1851 as Margaret Wheeler, a young woman from Boston whose father had arranged her marriage to Harold Blackwood, owner of one of the most prosperous cotton plantations in the state. The Wheeler family, while respected in Massachusetts society, had suffered financial reversals, and the marriage represented security. What Margaret discovered upon arriving at the plantation was a property in decline. The soil was depleted from years of cotton cultivation. The workforce was diminished by disease and escape. Harold Blackwood was deeply in debt to factors in Charleston who had advanced him money against future crops that had failed to materialize. The first year of their marriage passed in relative quiet. Harold spent his days in the fields or in his study, examining ledgers that showed mounting debt. Margaret took to walking the grounds, learning the rhythms of plantation life, studying the landscape of rice fields along the river and cotton fields stretching toward the horizon. She kept a journal during this period, discovered decades later in a trunk in the attic of what remained of the Blackwood house. "I have counted 37 field hands working from sunrise until well past dusk," she wrote in April of 1852. "Harold says this is not enough. He says we need at least 60 to make the land profitable again. I asked where we would find these people. He did not answer. It was in the late summer of that year that things began to change. A letter arrived from Charleston that sent Harold into a rage. He locked himself in his study for 3 days, emerging disheveled and with a strange calmness that Margaret found more disturbing than his anger. "We have been granted a reprieve," he told her over dinner. "We have until next harvest to repay our debts." What he didn't tell her, what she would discover later through household accounts she was not meant to see, was that the reprieve had come at an enormous cost. Harold had signed promissory notes at ruinous interest rates. If the next year's crop failed, they would lose everything. The winter of 1852 was unusually cold. Frost killed what little kitchen garden remained. Food stores ran low. In her journal, Margaret noted that even the Blackwood family table was reduced to simple fare. The enslaved workers on the plantation received even less. Disease spread through the quarters. By January, 7 people had died. Harold seemed unmoved by the deaths. He spent hours in the small stone building behind the main house that had once served as a smokehouse but had been converted to a private study. Margaret was forbidden from entering. On February 17, 1853, Harold emerged from that building with soil on his hands and a plan. He gathered the remaining workforce and announced that they would be planting cotton in fields that had lain fallow for years. When his overseer protested that the soil couldn't support it, Harold dismissed him. Within a week, a new overseer arrived from Virginia. Silas Reynolds had a reputation for extracting maximum labor through brutal efficiency. What was unusual about Reynolds, according to accounts from workers later interviewed by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867, was his interest in local folk practices. He spent evenings talking with the oldest members of the enslaved community, asking questions about burial customs and spiritual beliefs. Margaret's journal entries from this period become increasingly disturbed. "I wake in the night to find Harold gone from our bed," she wrote in March. "Last night I followed him. He and Reynolds were digging in the old cemetery at the edge of the property. I could not see what they removed, but they carried a small wooden box to the smokehouse. Harold saw me watching from the window. At breakfast, he behaved as though nothing had happened." The first unusual death occurred on March 23rd. Elijah Morris, a field hand in his 30s, collapsed while working in the newly planted East Field. What made his death remarkable was not just its suddenness, but what happened afterward. According to kitchen staff who spoke in whispers, Reynolds took the body not to the cemetery, but to the smokehouse. When the body emerged, it was quickly buried without ceremony at the field's edge. The next day, Harold announced that the East Field would be extended by 3 acres. 2 days later, production reports show an unexpected surge in worker output in that field. Throughout April and May, a pattern emerged. A death would occur, typically of a healthy individual who showed no prior symptoms of illness. The body would disappear into the smokehouse for a night. The field where the person had worked would show extraordinary fertility. Margaret's journal becomes increasingly fragmented during this time. "The cotton grows too fast," she wrote in a shaky hand in May. "I watched yesterday. I swear I could see it rising from the ground, the white bolls swelling like strange fruit. Harold says I imagine things, but I have measured the plants. They grow inches overnight." By June, the Blackwood plantation was producing cotton at a rate that drew attention from neighboring plantations. Wealthy planters from miles around came to see what Harold had done to restore productivity to his fields. They were met with hospitality in the main house, but were not permitted to tour the fields unescorted. Reynolds maintained strict boundaries around the property. Margaret noted that visitors often left disquieted, though none could say exactly why. "Something in the air here disturbs them," she wrote. "As it should. They do not see what I see." What Margaret saw, according to her increasingly desperate journal entries, was a plantation where natural laws seemed suspended. Plants grew with unnatural vigor. The soil, once depleted, now produced abundant crops, and people continued to die. By July, the pattern had claimed 12 lives, each death followed by increased fertility in a specific field, each body passing through the smokehouse before burial. The most disturbing aspect of the journal comes in late July, when Margaret discovered she was with child. Her joy was tempered by growing suspicion about her husband's activities. "Harold touched my belly today and spoke of legacy," she wrote. "He said our child would inherit fields so fertile they would never know want. The way he looked at me as he said it made me cold, as though calculating value." In August, Margaret began her own investigation. While Harold and Reynolds were inspecting distant fields, she entered the forbidden smokehouse. She never explicitly recorded what she found there, but the journal pages from that day are stained with what laboratory analysis in 1965 would confirm was blood. Her writing becomes more urgent, more fractured. "The soil drinks," she wrote. "The cotton feeds. Harold has made a bargain with the earth, but the earth is not the only party to this contract." On September 2nd, Margaret gave birth to a daughter. The birth was difficult, and for 3 days it seemed both mother and child would survive. Then, on September 5th, the infant stopped breathing. Dr. Abernathy from Charleston was summoned, but by the time he arrived, Harold had already taken the tiny body to the smokehouse. What happened next is documented in multiple sources. Margaret's final journal entry, Dr. Abernathy's private correspondence found in the Charleston Historical Society archives in 1964, and fragments of testimony from household servants recorded years later. When Dr. Abernathy arrived at the Blackwood plantation on September 7th, he found Margaret in a state of profound distress. She told him that Harold and Reynolds had used their child in the same ritual they had performed with the others. The doctor, initially skeptical, was convinced to investigate the smokehouse. What he found there caused him to leave the plantation immediately. He rode through the night to Charleston, where he reported his findings to authorities. A party of law enforcement officers arrived at the Blackwood plantation on September 9th. They found the main house empty. Harold, Reynolds, and the remaining workers were discovered in the fields, engaged in what witnesses described as a frenzy of harvest. The cotton plants had grown to twice their normal height, the bolls so numerous that branches bent to the ground under their weight. The soil, according to reports, was dark and moist, despite weeks without rain. Harold and Reynolds were arrested and taken to Georgetown for questioning. Margaret was found in her bedroom, unresponsive and clutching her journal. She was committed to the state asylum in Columbia, where she remained until her death in 1871. She never spoke again. The investigators searched the smokehouse and discovered evidence of what they termed in their official report heathen practices incompatible with Christian burial. The wooden floor had been removed, revealing a pit dug into the earth. The pit contained a mixture of soil, plant matter, and human remains. Analysis by a medical examiner confirmed the presence of blood and tissue from multiple individuals. Most disturbing was the discovery of small bones, identified as belonging to an infant. Harold Blackwood never stood trial. He died in his cell on the night of September 12th, apparently by his own hand. Silas Reynolds escaped custody during transfer to Charleston and was never found. The Blackwood plantation was sold at auction to cover debts. The new owner reported that despite the impressive standing crop, subsequent plantings yielded nothing. The soil, once supernaturally fertile, had become completely barren. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the apparent ritual sacrifice of human lives for agricultural gain, but the meticulous documentation of the process. Harold Blackwood kept ledgers, found in a hidden compartment in the smokehouse, that detailed the exchange rate of lives for crop yield. Each entry calculated the expected value of cotton produced against the investment required. The final entry, dated September 5th, simply read, "Bloodline committed, permanent yield secured." The Blackwood case might have remained buried in county records and private collections, if not for the work of Dr. Eleanor Simmons, a historian researching agricultural practices in the antebellum South. In 1962, while examining records at the Georgetown County Courthouse, she discovered references to the Blackwood plantation and its unusual productivity in 1853. Her subsequent investigation uncovered Margaret's journal, Dr. Abernathy's correspondence, and fragments of the official investigation. Dr. Simmons published her findings in a small academic journal in 1964. The article attracted little attention until 1968, when construction workers breaking ground for a new housing development near the former Blackwood property uncovered a mass grave containing the remains of at least 15 individuals. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bodies dated to the mid-19th century. Most disturbing was the discovery that each skull bore a small, precise hole at the base, as though something had been carefully extracted. The housing development was never completed. The land remains vacant, overgrown with vegetation that local residents claim grows in strange patterns. Soil samples taken from the area in 1968 showed unusual mineral content and organic compounds that defied explanation with the scientific methods available at the time. The samples were sent to a laboratory at the University of South Carolina, but were reportedly lost in a fire that destroyed part of the facility in 1969. What became known as the Blackwood Harvest represents one of the most disturbing intersections of economic desperation, spiritual corruption, and human exploitation in American history. Harold Blackwood, faced with financial ruin, apparently turned to practices that transformed human life into agricultural productivity. The precise nature of these practices remains unclear. Some scholars have suggested connections to West African religious traditions distorted through the lens of plantation power dynamics. Others point to European folk beliefs about blood sacrifice and soil fertility. Whatever the case, the documentation suggests that Harold and Reynolds had developed a systematic approach to converting human suffering into cotton production. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case is its economic rationality. Harold's ledgers show a man who had reduced human life to a production input, calculated with the same cold precision he applied to equipment costs or transport fees. In this, the Blackwood case serves as a dark metaphor for the plantation economy itself, where human beings were already commodified and exploited. Harold merely took this logic to its most extreme conclusion. The story of Margaret Blackwood offers a different perspective. Her journey from privileged Boston society woman to horrified witness parallels a larger awakening to the moral catastrophe of the plantation system. Her final act, attempting to expose what was happening even as she lost her child to it, speaks to a moral reckoning that came too late. The land where the Blackwood plantation stood has changed hands many times since 1853. No structure has successfully remained standing on the property for more than a few years. Local residents report unusual phenomena: plants that grow and wither overnight, soil that seems to shift without wind or rain, sounds of digging when no one is present. These reports, while impossible to verify, speak to the lasting psychological impact of the Blackwood case on the community's collective memory. In 1968, shortly before her death, Dr. Eleanor Simmons conducted a final interview with Ida Mae Jackson, then 97 years old, whose grandmother had been a house servant on a neighboring plantation. Jackson recalled stories passed down about the Blackwood place. "My grandmama told me they made a deal with something hungry," Jackson said, "something that lived in the dirt and fed on suffering. They thought they was just feeding it workers, but that thing, it got greedy. It wanted Blackwood blood too. And once it got that taste, it never stopped wanting more." The records of the Blackwood case remain incomplete. Much of the official investigation was lost when the Georgetown courthouse suffered water damage during a hurricane in 1989. Margaret's journal, housed in the South Carolina Historical Society, has deteriorated to the point where many pages are now illegible. What remains are fragments of a story about human greed, desperation, and the terrible price of prosperity built on exploitation. Perhaps the final word on the Blackwood case comes from an unexpected source. In 1871, shortly after Margaret Blackwood's death at the state asylum, a nurse recorded her only spoken words in 18 years. "The cotton still grows. It grows from our bones." The fields where the Blackwood plantation once stood are now covered with pine forest. No cotton has grown there for more than a century, but locals say that sometimes, in the right light, when the wind moves through the trees, you can see white tufts catching the sunlight, like cotton bowls heavy with harvest, reaching up from soil that remembers the taste of blood and the weight of a terrible bargain. In 1957, a graduate student from the University of North Carolina attempted to conduct soil samples as part of a broader study of agricultural land use in the region. According to his field notes, discovered among his effects after his disappearance, he observed that the soil in the area had an unusual composition. "The earth seems to repel standard testing equipment," he wrote. "Metal corrodes on contact. Sample containers crack overnight. The soil itself appears to move when not directly observed." The student James Carrington ventured onto the property alone on October 3, 1957. His car was found parked on a nearby logging road. His body was never recovered. The Carrington disappearance prompted a brief investigation by local authorities, but without evidence of foul play, the case was soon relegated to the back pages of the Georgetown newspaper. What did not make the papers, however, was the testimony of Samuel Tucker, a local farmer who had been hunting in the woods near the old Blackwood land on the day Carrington disappeared. Tucker, speaking only to family members, claimed he heard a sound like the earth swallowing something whole, followed by what he described as the rustle of cotton plants where no cotton grows. Tucker refused to make an official statement, and his account might have been lost if his grandson had not recorded it on tape in 1966 as part of an oral history project. That tape, stored in the folklore archives at the College of Charleston, contains another disturbing claim. Tucker stated that in the weeks following Carrington's disappearance, the trees along the border of the old Blackwood property produced unusual fruit. They wasn't pine cones, he said. They was round and white, like cotton bolls. But when you touched them, they felt wet, like something soaked in blood trying to dry in the sun. The connection between the Blackwood case and the disappearance of James Carrington might have remained speculative if not for a discovery made in 1959. A hunter, tracking a wounded deer, stumbled upon a small leather satchel caught in the undergrowth near where Carrington had last been seen. The satchel contained soil sampling equipment, notebooks, and a small tape recorder. The notebooks were water-damaged and largely illegible, but the tape recorder contained a partial recording of Carrington's final field notes. The recording, now stored in the South Carolina State Archives, is mostly corrupted by static and environmental noise. However, 3 segments remain audible. In the first, Carrington describes finding what appears to be the foundation stones of the old smokehouse. "The soil here is different," he says, his voice steady and professional. "Darker than the surrounding area. Moisture content significantly higher despite the recent drought." The second audible segment, recorded approximately 20 minutes later according to the tape counter, captures a change in Carrington's demeanor. His voice is hushed, almost whispering. "There's something moving beneath the surface, not animal. The soil itself seems to shift and flow in patterns that follow my movements. When I stand still, it settles. When I move, it responds." The final segment, time-stamped 47 minutes after the recording began, consists of a single sentence before the tape dissolves into unintelligible noise. Carrington, his voice now shaking, says simply, "It's pulling me down. The earth is hungry." Folklorist Dr. Regina Martinez, who analyzed the tape in 1963, noted that the background noise in the final segment contained what sound analysis suggested were human voices speaking in unison, though no words could be distinguished. More disturbing was her observation that the rhythm of these voices matched exactly the cadence of work songs documented on neighboring plantations in the 1850s. The Blackwood story might have remained a local legend if not for the publication of Blood Cotton, the Blackwood Harvest, and the Economics of Atrocity by historian Dr. Malcolm Jenkins in 1966. Jenkins, having gained access to Harold Blackwood's ledgers through a descendant of the courthouse clerk, who had originally documented the case, provided the first comprehensive analysis of the economic calculations behind the plantation's gruesome practices. What made Jenkins' work particularly disturbing was his discovery of a pattern that extended beyond the Blackwood plantation. Through careful examination of production records from across the South Carolina Lowcountry, he identified 7 other plantations with similar anomalous spikes in productivity between 1845 and 1860. Each coincided with an unexplained increase in mortality rates among the enslaved population. While none showed the meticulous documentation found in the Blackwood case, the statistical correlation was, in Jenkins' words, too precise to be coincidental. Jenkins theorized that knowledge of the practice Harold Blackwood had employed, what Jenkins called sacrificial agriculture, had circulated among a small network of desperate planters facing financial ruin. His research suggested that Silas Reynolds, who disappeared after the Blackwood case, may have served as a vector for this knowledge, appearing as an overseer on at least 2 other plantations that subsequently showed unnatural increases in productivity. The publication of Jenkins' book coincided with the civil rights movement and renewed interest in the brutal realities of plantation slavery. While some dismissed his findings as sensationalism, the documented evidence he presented could not be easily refuted. The Blackwood case came to represent not just a singular atrocity, but a logical extension of a system that already treated human beings as expendable resources. In 1967, a film crew from a regional public television station attempted to produce a documentary about the Blackwood case. Their equipment repeatedly malfunctioned at the plantation site. The completed documentary, which relied heavily on interviews and archival footage, aired only once before the master tape was destroyed in what the station manager described as an inexplicable degradation of the magnetic medium. Viewers who saw the broadcast reported that during segments filmed near the former plantation, human voices could be heard in the background, despite the crew having been alone at the site. The land where the Blackwood plantation stood has never been successfully developed. In 1972, a timber company purchased the property with plans to clear-cut the pine forest that had grown over the former fields. Within a week, 3 industrial saws had broken on what workers described as something harder than metal just below the soil surface. 2 workers were hospitalized with an unidentified skin condition after prolonged contact with soil from the site. The timber company abandoned the project, selling the land at a loss to a hunting club that subsequently went bankrupt without ever using the property. The most recent documented investigation of the Blackwood case occurred in 1968, when Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a soil scientist from MIT, conducted the first modern analysis of soil samples from the former plantation. Her findings, published in an obscure scientific journal later that year, described a soil composition unlike anything previously recorded in the region. The samples contained elevated levels of iron, calcium, and phosphorus, all consistent with the presence of human remains, but arranged in molecular structures that, according to Dr. Chen, appeared to have been deliberately engineered rather than naturally occurring. Most disturbing was Dr. Chen's observation that the samples continued to show metabolic activity in laboratory conditions. The soil appears to consume organic matter at an accelerated rate, she wrote. When isolated in sealed containers with organic material, the samples not only decomposed this material completely, but increased in mass by a factor inconsistent with standard physical principles. Dr. Chen's research was discontinued when her laboratory was destroyed in a fire in December 1968. The official investigation concluded that the fire resulted from an electrical fault, though Dr. Chen, in private correspondence found, after her death in 1984, expressed her belief that something in the samples had grown strong enough to escape containment. The academic community largely dismissed Dr. Chen's findings as contaminated results or experimental error. The Blackwood case retreated once more into local folklore and specialized historical interest. Yet periodically, incidents occur that bring the story back into focus. In 1979, a family picnicking near the old plantation boundaries reported that their youngest child, a girl of 4, had wandered into the woods and disappeared for several hours. When found, the child was physically unharmed, but clutching what the parents described as a doll made of cotton bolls and twigs. According to the police report, the child said she had been playing with the people under the ground who were growing from the dirt. The family moved from the area shortly afterward. In 1985, a severe drought affected much of South Carolina. Satellite imagery taken during this period showed an anomaly. While surrounding forests showed signs of water stress, the vegetation on the former Blackwood property remained vibrant and green. Environmental scientists who noted this discrepancy planned an investigation, but funding was diverted to more pressing drought relief efforts. By the time resources became available, seasonal rains had returned, and the anomaly was no longer visible. Perhaps the most compelling recent connection to the Blackwood case emerged in 1988, when renovations to an old home in Charleston revealed a hidden cache of letters in a wall cavity. The letters, dated between 1853 and 1855, were written by Josephine Pickering, a cousin of Margaret Blackwood, who had visited the plantation shortly before the events described in the official record. In these letters, addressed to her sister in Philadelphia, Pickering described conversations with Margaret that foreshadowed the horror to come. Margaret speaks of strange rituals performed by the enslaved people at night. Pickering wrote in April 1853, "Not the Christian worship their master pretends to encourage, but older practices brought from Africa. Harold has taken an unusual interest in these ceremonies. Margaret tells me he has asked Reynolds to document them in detail. She fears her husband seeks something from these rituals beyond mere curiosity." In a later letter, dated June 1853, Pickering wrote, "Margaret confided that Harold and Reynolds have begun their own ceremonies in the old smokehouse. She has heard chanting in languages she does not recognize. Harold returns to their bed with soil embedded beneath his fingernails that will not wash clean. She asked me to help her leave this place. I regret now that I dismissed her fears as those of a woman in a delicate condition." The final letter in the collection, dated October 1853, after the public discovery of the Blackwood atrocities, reveals Pickering's guilt. "I failed her. I might have saved Margaret and her child had I heeded her warnings. She told me that Harold had made a bargain with something ancient that lived in the soil, something that had been fed by generations of suffering on that land. He believed he could control it through ritual and sacrifice." Margaret said the enslaved people knew better. They had always known what slept beneath those fields. They had kept it contained through their own practices, their own offerings. Harold's interference broke ancient boundaries. What he awakened now thirsts without end. The Pickering letters provide a crucial perspective missing from official accounts. The understanding that the Blackwood ritual was not created in isolation, but represented a perversion of existing spiritual practices, a colonial appropriation that violated both human bodies and spiritual boundaries. This interpretation has been championed by Dr. Amara Johnson, whose 2002 book, Sacred Ground, Stolen Rights, Spiritual Appropriation and Resistance in the Plantation South, places the Blackwood case within a broader context of cultural theft and resistance. According to Dr. Johnson's research, the practices Harold Blackwood and Silas Reynolds adapted were distortions of protective rituals designed to honor ancestors and maintain spiritual balance. What Blackwood created, Johnson writes, was a spiritual abomination that inverted the intended purpose of these practices. Rather than maintaining harmony between the living, the dead, and the land, his ritual created a parasitic relationship that consumed all three. Johnson's work draws on oral histories from descendants of enslaved people from neighboring plantations collected in the 1930s as part of the Federal Writers Project. These accounts describe Blackwood as a man who stole power that wasn't his to take, and opened doors that should have stayed closed. They speak of the land as being poisoned not just with blood, but with broken promises to the ancestors. The most recent chapter in the Blackwood story began in 2004, when Hurricane Gavin swept through coastal South Carolina, toppling trees and exposing long-buried structures on the former plantation property. In the aftermath, archaeological surveyors documented the foundations of the main house, several outbuildings, and most significantly, the smokehouse where Harold Blackwood conducted his rituals. The excavation of the smokehouse site revealed a circular pit lined with a mixture of clay, charcoal, and what preliminary analysis suggested was human bone meal. At the center of the pit, archaeologists discovered a small metal box containing a leather-bound notebook. The notebook, now preserved in a climate-controlled facility at the South Carolina State Museum, contains what appears to be Silas Reynolds's documentation of the Blackwood ritual. Written in a precise, educated hand, the notebook details a systematic process of enriching the soil through vital essence. Reynolds describes collecting specimen material, blood, tissue and bone, from living subjects and combining it with soil from different sections of the plantation in specific proportions. Most disturbing is his clinical tone, recording each death as a successful integration and noting improvements in soil quality with the detachment of a modern agricultural scientist. The final pages of Reynolds' notebook reveal his growing awareness that the process he and Blackwood had initiated was slipping beyond their control. "The soil now responds to presence alone," he wrote in an increasingly agitated hand. "It reaches toward footsteps. It shifts toward heartbeats." Blackwood believes his child will provide the final binding element, cementing our control through bloodline connection. I am less certain. What we have awakened has appetites of its own. Modern scholars remain divided on how to interpret the Blackwood case. Scientific rationalists point to the possibility of ergot or other fungal contaminants that might explain both the agricultural anomalies and the psychological state of the participants. Soil scientists suggest that the fertilization practices, while gruesome, may have inadvertently created a unique microbiome that enhanced productivity. Historians contextualize the case as an extreme manifestation of plantation capitalism's inherent brutality. Yet for the residents of Georgetown County, the Blackwood plantation remains a place avoided after dark, a location omitted from tourist maps despite the region's embrace of plantation tourism. Local schools do not teach the case, though children exchange whispered versions on playgrounds. The land remains undeveloped, the forest growing denser each year, concealing whatever secrets still lie beneath the soil. In 2006, a small memorial was finally erected at the edge of the property, commemorating the unnamed victims of the Blackwood harvest. The ceremony, attended by descendants of enslaved people from neighboring plantations, included traditional prayers and offerings. Elder Josephine Washington, then 92, spoke words passed down through generations. "We return today to close what was opened. We speak names that were silenced. We honor lives that were taken. May the earth remember them not as sacrifice, but as ancestors worthy of rest." Whether the memorial has brought peace to the troubled land remains uncertain. Local residents report that the strange phenomena, unexplained sounds, vegetation that moves without wind, soil that shifts underfoot, have diminished in recent years. Yet occasionally, especially after heavy rains, people driving past the old plantation boundaries at dusk report seeing something white and fibrous pushing up through the forest floor, like cotton bolls reaching for the fading light before sinking back into the waiting earth. The Blackwood case stands as a stark reminder of how human greed can transform exploitation into something even more monstrous. In his desperate attempt to maintain his wealth and status, Harold Blackwood violated not just human bodies, but the fundamental relationship between people and the land that sustains them. The productivity he achieved came at a cost that transcended even the brutal calculus of plantation slavery, creating a debt that, according to local belief, continues to be paid. As historian Malcolm Jenkins wrote in the conclusion to his book, "The true horror of the Blackwood harvest lies not in its supernatural elements, which may be dismissed as folklore, but in its economic rationality." Harold Blackwood simply took the logic of plantation capitalism to its ultimate conclusion. If human beings could be reduced to commodities, why not reduce them further to raw materials? The soil of the Blackwood plantation was fertilized not just with blood, but with the plantation system's most fundamental assumption, that some lives could be sacrificed for the profit of others. Today, the pine forest that covers the former Blackwood plantation appears peaceful, indistinguishable from the surrounding woodlands. The descendants of those who survived the Blackwood harvest have scattered across the country, carrying fragments of the story with them. The land itself keeps whatever secrets remain, buried beneath layers of pine needles and rich, dark soil that locals still say grows too well, too quickly, as if fed by something more than rain and sunlight. For those who study the case, the most disturbing aspect may be how easily it was forgotten, how a systematic atrocity could be relegated to local folklore and academic footnotes. Perhaps this, too, is part of the Blackwood legacy. The ease with which horror can be absorbed into the landscape, becoming just another shadow beneath the trees, another whisper in the rustle of leaves that might be the wind, or might be something else, something still hungry after all these years. The most recent documented incident occurred in 2002, when a field researcher from the University of Georgia, conducting a wildlife survey in the area, reported finding a circle of white cotton bolls arranged around the stump of a recently fallen pine. According to her field notes, the bolls appeared fresh and vital, despite being miles from the nearest cotton field. When she returned the following day with a camera, the bolls had disappeared, leaving only dark stains on the forest floor that chemical analysis later identified as containing human hemoglobin, though the source could not be determined. The Blackwood harvest remains an open wound in the landscape of American history, a wound that neither time nor forest growth has fully healed. It stands as testament to the darkest potential of human ambition, untempered by moral restraint, a cautionary tale of what can happen when profit becomes more important than life itself. For the people of Georgetown County, the story serves as a boundary marker, a warning about limits that should not be crossed. Some lands are best left undisturbed, as local resident James Wilson told a reporter in 1998. Some hungers are best left unfed. The Blackwood place remembers what was done there, and what remembers can wait a very long time. The sun sets over the pine forest that has reclaimed the Blackwood fields. In the deepening shadows, the soil shifts slightly, as if stirring in sleep. Beneath the surface, something waits, patient, hungry, and unforgetting. The bargain struck in 1853 remains in force. The cotton still grows, though no one plants it. It grows from bones long since dissolved into the waiting earth. It grows from a debt still unpaid. It grows from a story that refuses to end.